Hey y'all, coming to you from Cincinnati, Ohio this week. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Reftelis and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're talking climate action in Denver. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. ELGL is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. Now let me introduce today's guest. Grace Rink is the Chief Climate Officer and Executive Director of the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency for the City of Denver, Colorado, a position she's been in since 2020. Prior to joining the city, she worked as a consultant for several sustainability consulting firms in the Chicago area. She did that for about 13 years and also served as Assistant Commissioner for the City of Chicago's Department of Environment for 6 years before that. With that, welcome to GovLove, Grace. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Cool. So we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round to get to know our guests a little better. So my first question for you is, what book are you currently reading?
Yikes. I'm in between books right now, but I actually get the Sunday New York Times in print every week.
Ooh.
And it takes me at least a week to read it all. So that's where I'm at right now.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I subscribed to the local paper for a while, but it felt like a chore after a while where you're like, how do I keep up with this?
Yeah,
So much
I have
content.
to say, I like getting the New York Times in print because I think that I read many stories that I might otherwise skip if I only saw it online.
Yeah, that's fair. That's very fair. All right, so my next lightning round question for you. What was the last movie you saw in theaters or streamed?
Oh, I saw the new Black Panther movie. That was probably at the end of last year.
Oh, nice.
In the theater.
In the theaters, yeah. I just streamed that one. What'd you think?
Oh, I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah. It's fun. Awesome. So my next line question for you. What's your favorite lunch spot in Denver?
Oh, yeah. So I'm not a good one to ask because I make all my meals. I actually derive a lot of joy from cooking.
Ooh,
And so
okay.
and I'm kind of frugal as well. So I pack my lunch every day.
Oh, okay. Do you have like a after work spot that you like it in Denver? If any of our listeners are in the area?
Well, I'm in the downtown area, over by the state capitol, and there
Mhm.
are a lot of really great places to go around here. Frankly, the whole 16th Street Mall, of course, is a lot of fun. And then there's a couple holes in the wall sort of off on Bannock Street, which is I would say to the south of the city and county building.
Mhm.
I don't think I can name one right now, but I think if you hit that street, you're going to find a couple of great watering holes.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. And then my last lightning question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
Well, now that I live in a mountain state, I go to the mountains.
Yeah.
There's so much to do, so much exploring to do in the outdoors in Colorado, and not just in the winter. There is actually more to do outside of the winter months out here, and it's really beautiful and lovely and serene.
Very cool. Was there like a new activity you picked up since moving to Colorado?
Oh, certainly, yes. Paddleboarding. I never did paddleboarding before, and now we own 2 inflatable paddleboards and have gotten pretty adept at just throwing them in the car and going out somewhere.
Oh, wow. That's impressive. I feel like I tried to stand on one paddleboard and I tipped over several times.
You know
and I
what?
gave up.
Here's the great thing about a paddleboard. You don't have to stand on them. I don't stand on it either. So I treat it like a very flat kayak, and it's lovely.
Perfect. Awesome. I love that. Cool. So I read a little bit of your kind of bio at the beginning, but I'm curious, just from your perspective, what was your path to local government? I always like to hear from folks about how they ended up in this field, and it's interesting to there's no one path, right? So
Yep.
For you, how did you kind of end up in local government, and had you end up in your career?
I am happy to share my origin story. It does go back a ways. So when I was in college in the mid 90s, I graduated with a degree in history and political science, and everybody said to me, "Oh, are you going to teach or go to law school?" Like those are the only 2 choices I had.
Yep.
And I wanted to save the world by fixing public education. And I had a place to stay in Chicago, which at the time was the epicenter of the school reform movement. And so I just dropped anchor there. And I actually, before the internet, in order to find my way into that sector, I actually went to the library every day. I read every publication that I could find on the local school reform scene, which at the time was very heavy in nonprofits. And I would see people quoted in articles, and I would call them. And I would say, "Hi, I'm new in town, and I'm interested in what you do, and could I come interview you?" And of course, as we're doing right now, everybody loves talking about themselves. So everybody said yes. And every one of those informational interviews I had, the person would say, you know what, you need to talk to so-and-so and so-and-so. And I would walk out of there with other references. And within 6 months, I had talked to almost everybody in the school reform movement, and one of them offered me a job. And so that was in the nonprofit sector. I was in that for about a year and a half. And then the state legislature in Illinois gave control of the school district to the mayor, who was then able to appoint the school board and the CEO. And all of us saw the writing on the wall that the power was really just going to move from the nonprofit sector over to the district. And I jumped ship and I went and knocked on the door and found my way into the public school district. And so I worked in the CEO's office there. Wow. And eventually made my way. So that's how I was in public policy in general. And then I got to know folks at the Chicago Department of Environment, because while I was at the school district, I got a grant from a unnamed oil company that was dedicated to creating environmental service projects for high school students. And so I went to the folks at the Department of Environment to help me figure out, how to make really good projects. And after working with them for years, they said, hey, we've got this position over here. Do you want to make the switch? And so I switched from educational policy to environmental policy. And that's it. The road's been paved ever since.
Wow. Very cool. Well, I'm curious. I know you spent some time as a consultant working with, several local governments in this space. Any kind of takeaways from your time working with lots of local governments that maybe prepared you for your current role working for the city of Denver?
Sure. Well, first off, I love working for cities. I think that the scale of the work that we can do at the city level is tremendous. And there's so much control, especially in the environmental space. There's so much that city governments can do at a local level that you can't do at a state or you can't do at the federal government. And we do need those levels engaged as well. Mm-hmm. But just think about all the zoning codes and the building codes. And I'm not even in that sector, mm-hmm. right? I don't control the building code. I'm not an urban planner. But there's so much work to be done at the local level. And we touch so many different subjects. So no matter what city I have worked for or worked with, I'm always impressed with the amount of work that we're able to accomplish at the city level.
Yeah, very cool. So in prepping for this interview, I read a little bit about kind of the creation of your office and some of the Climate Protection Fund and some of the work going on in Denver. So I'd just be curious for you to talk about, so for our listeners, what was maybe kind of, can you give a little background on kind of the creation of your team and maybe what guides your work and some of the unique, if there are any kind of climate action challenges that that Denver deals with or that y'all are working on?
Yes. I'll start with an origin that I think, I actually don't know how unique this is to Colorado, mm-hmm. but I've been in local government for over 25 years and I'd never heard of this before. So mm-hmm. in Colorado, no unit of government can raise taxes on their own. All tax increases must be voted on by the people. Hmm. And it is also really not very difficult for a citizen-led group to get an initiative on the ballot for mm-hmm. people to vote on taxes in particular. So what happened was in 2019, there was a group of environmental activists in Denver that had gathered enough signatures to get an energy tax on the ballot. And that would have created a tax on energy usage with the objective, of course, of getting people to reduce their energy use. But in the meantime, it would raise about $40 million for the city to do climate action work.
Wow.
Well, I think a lot of people like the idea of raising that money, but a lot of people, even more people, did not like the idea of a tax on energy, including the mayor and members of the city council. So they came together with the activists and negotiated a compromise, which was that Denver, which had been doing sustainability work for over a decade, but had been doing it under a common format or structure where you have a chief sustainability officer in the mayor's office, a couple of staff people who then generally consult with other agencies on how to embed sustainability in their work. But the negotiation resulted in creating an actual agency. And our agency is in code. So it's not even just an appointment by the mayor. It's actually, there's an ordinance that created our agency. Huh. And then the city also agreed to create what we called the Climate Action Task Force, which was a group of 25 individuals, not city staff people. So folks representing all of Denver, right? Big business, small business, neighborhoods, community-based organizations, every different ethnicity and other personal identity that we have here in Denver. All those people came to the table And they met for 6 months. Obviously, this is now, at this point, it's 2020. So during the pandemic, they had to pivot from in-person to virtual. And they came out with a 100+ page document, which was essentially a roadmap for how this new office should operate, or like what our goals should be. And then lastly, part of the negotiation also created the position that I have, which is the Chief Climate Officer and then Executive Director of this new office. So I think that background's important because the citizen-led ballot initiative process has continued to be a really important feature of our work. And I'll pause there before, unless you want me to talk about our very famous now climate tax.
Yeah, actually, that's probably a good segue. So yeah, can you talk about that? Yeah.
Sure. So then again, the Climate Action Task Force identified at least 6 different funding streams that the city could implement in order to raise money for this office. And they had equity at the core of their work. They had to continue looking at, how do we make sure that any way that we raise money has the least negative impact on the people who are most harmed by climate change impacts, right? And the energy tax is not that solution. It is very regressive, and it's only paid by the ratepayers within the city and county of Denver. A sales tax in Denver is actually less regressive. A lot of people think that sales taxes are regressive, and in many places they are, and in many cases they are. But here in Denver, number one, in Colorado, there's a number of personal items that are exempt from sales tax. So food is one category that's exempt from sales tax. So that alone makes it less regressive than it is in other places. But also in Denver in particular, of our total sales tax revenue, about 35% of it is paid by people who do not live in Denver. So it's paid for by visitors to the city, by tourists, by folks just coming into the city and shopping. So it spreads the cost of the sales tax out over a greater number of people and businesses. And so the recommendation from the task force was that city council put forward an initiative on the ballot for the fall of 2020 to create a 0.25% sales tax, which would raise about $40 million a year for our office, which at this point had been created. That was another part of what made the 2019 proposal challenging for the city, is that had it passed, there would not have been an office that was ready to receive those dollars and actually put them into action. And so this sequencing, by creating our office first, then having the people vote on this other sales tax measure, worked out better structurally.
Yeah.
And that actually passed with 64% of the vote. And I have to tell you, again, this is November 2020. You remember, you have to take yourself back to the pandemic, the economic distress that so many people were under. I have to tell you, even though people in Denver have voted for other sales tax increases, at that moment in time, it was probably only 3 weeks before the election where we looked at each other and said, I think this thing's going to pass. And then it did. I mean, we just did not think that was a moment when anyone was going to have an appetite for it. But, climate and equity were absolutely front and center all that year. And I think that that the people really took that to heart. Denver, the population of Denver has been very supportive of environmental work for a long time. And so we were just thrilled that our new office was ready to receive these dollars.
That's so cool. That's such a it seems unique as a background. And the fact that you have both community pressure at the kind of core, pushing you guys to go, the city to go further, and then also a funding mechanism like that. I mean, as a good public administrator, that's awesome.
It is. And in this sector, in climate work, money really does make a difference. I mean, we've been able to, I'm sure we're going to talk about that. We've been able to do a lot of really exciting work for the city with that money. Yeah.
So that kind of roadmap process that the task force helped y'all put together, I assume, was the city facilitating those conversations? How do you kind of take 25 probably very disparate opinions about what's the biggest priority and kind of turn that into a roadmap that your staff can now kind of use to guide their
that's
work?
A good question. So our task force is run by consensus, and at the worst case scenario is consensus -1. And so when they had all the different recommendations and ideas and thoughts to deliberate over, they really had to hone in on ones that they could truly agree on. And whether it's, goals such as, Denver's emissions reduction goal for a long time has been 80 by 50. an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. They recommended that we move to 100% emissions reduction completely.
Wow.
And then in 2021, we had a follow-on recommendation from another standing committee that we have of scientists and researchers who also recommended to the city, based on all the current climate science, that we needed to set a goal of reducing emissions 100% by 2040. And the mayor adopted that goal.
Wow.
So having the task force, the Climate Action Task Force, lay the groundwork for us and make really clear what the long-term goals need to be, along with some of the steps along the way, that has really helped us as we've built our policies, as we've created new programs, because we can go back to that process and say, listen, this diverse group of stakeholders came together, made this recommendation. They studied this issue really closely. Here's what they think we should do. And we're still engaged with so many of those people through a follow-on committee that we have called the Sustainability Advisory Council. We meet with them monthly. It's 140 people on 7 different committees. I know. It sounds nuts. But it works because we now have committees, standing committees for every one of the common subjects in our field. And again, these are all external stakeholders. They are all just people in Denver volunteering their time and their talents to come to us and bring us their ideas. And then we get to bounce our ideas off of them. And we reach consensus so that when we come out with a program or when we come out with a policy, we've got real support from the people behind us.
Yeah. You already have community buy-in. I mean, 140 people.
I know.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
You already have that buy-in and you've already done that outreach to some extent before you even kind of propose a new idea.
That is correct. And so here's a good example for you.
Yeah.
In 2021, we ran another task force called the Energized Denver Task Force. Now, this was interesting. This was a case where our office wanted to create a building performance policy. So we already have benchmarking, where large commercial buildings have to report to the city what their energy use is every year, but we did not have a requirement that they have to reduce it. We wanted to move to that next phase. But if we had simply come up with this policy and taken it straight to city council ourselves, the city council chambers would have been filled with people who were opposed to it. Probably all the people who are regulated by it, right? So instead, we formed a task force. We brought those people to the table, the representatives of the industries and the sectors that would be regulated by it. And we explored, I'm not even saying negotiated, we explored all the issues with them for 9 months.
Oh my gosh.
And then when we finally we took all the recommendations, we wrote the ordinance, we took it to city council, not one voice of opposition.
Wow.
Right.
Because they felt heard and included in the process. And wow.
They've been heard and included. And so, when I first came here, I came from Chicago. I had not had that experience before. And I was skeptical. I thought that it takes a lot more time, time up front if you're going to develop a policy that way. But boy, does it ever save you in the end. And, we don't have whole sectors of the city angry at us over what a policy is doing or what it's not doing, because they've all been at the table and they've been able to, as you said, have their voice heard, and they can actually point to things in the ordinance that they helped create. Yeah. And it's made such a huge difference in what we've been able to achieve.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. So I've maybe more of a nitty gritty question for you then. That kind of process to kind of set up a task force, engage, dive deep on an issue in order to make sure folks feel heard and all the points are considered. How do you kind of staff and approach something like that? If there's a new challenge or a new thing that, the city wants to do and you want to start this process, what does that kind of look like from just from a resource perspective? How do you assign folks to it? What does this kind of back and forth look like over time, over those 9 months to get to kind of the end result?
Yeah. It's going to vary by the subject at hand. So when we had the Climate Action Task Force, it was a process that involved a number of different city agencies. And so our staff would serve as subject matter experts and advisors to the council. So in that case, there were probably at least 20 city staff members from a variety of agencies who gave anywhere from a couple hours a month to, 10 to 20 hours a month in that process. Energize Denver, we staffed that almost entirely ourselves, but by that time, our buildings and homes team probably had 10 people on staff. So they were able to spread that work out amongst them. And we had a paid consultant as well. But I'm starting another task force right now to follow up on another citizen-led ballot initiative that has created Denver's first requirement that the entire private sector has to offer recycling and composting in every facility.
Oh,
And
wow.
I actually don't have a staff of my own in my agency dedicated to solid or to zero waste and circular economy. I'm building that. I actually have a manager starting for that in just a few weeks, and then they'll be building a team. So for the moment, it's me. And I do have some colleagues in other agencies who are also helping out. But it's a big contrast between the staffing support that we already had in place when we started the Energize Denver process versus the lack of staff we have in place now. We will be building that up as the task force gets going.
Yeah, interesting. So in that case, you're almost building the plane as you're flying it. Well,
We are, but in this case, we don't really have a choice because this ballot initiative was voted on just this past fall, so November of 22, and it's already the law. Yeah. And there are some elements of it. It just isn't written the way that Denver would write an ordinance. But in order to make any changes, the way the law works here in Colorado is we would need a supermajority of city council to approve any changes to a ballot measure. And so we have to be very deliberative in how we revise it. And so that's why it's worthy of another task force effort.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Very cool. So not to shift gears too hard, but I want to kind of go back to the funding that you have and some of the programs that you guys can use it for. So just maybe at a high level, like what are the types of things you can use this this $40 million a year what are the kinds of things you can use to fund with that, and what are the areas that you can use that money for, I guess. Right,
that's a good question, and kind of going back to the way the law works with these ballot initiatives. The people of Denver did not just give us one great big pot of $40 million. So we are actually only allowed to spend it on what was written in the ballot and ballot language itself. And so there are 6 categories. Workforce development, and it's specific to the energy transition and stewardship of natural areas, renewables and battery storage, energy efficiency in buildings and homes, sustainable mobility, and then climate and climate resilience and adaptation, and then climate and environmental justice. And those last 2 categories we are working on the definitions with the communities that are most harmed by climate change impacts. And we understand those to be people of color and indigenous people, communities where the majority of residents have lower incomes, people with disabilities, people living with chronic health conditions, and babies, children, and older adults. And so I mentioned our communications team earlier. We are spending a lot of time in Denver's, in the neighborhoods of Denver that meet those different criteria, and actually talking to people about, how is climate change impacting their lives, and what are the solutions that they see would be relevant in their community. And then we are building our policies and programs on what we learn from them. So those are the categories of what we can spend on.
Yeah. That's fascinating. That's such a mix, a wide diversity of things.
It is. And you can hear so we can't just spend all $40 million on buildings in one year and then $40 million on transportation the next year. It would never work like that. We really have to spread it across those different categories every year. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess since we've already talked a little bit about buildings, what are some of the programs in that kind of area? You mentioned kind of updating regulations, but I assume that you're also trying to probably incentivize homeowners to change things as well. But so what are what's the kind of work that you're doing in that building space?
All of the funding that is going out in the buildings category is aimed at electrifying our space and water heating in our buildings. Space and water heating in buildings and homes in Denver accounts for 64% of our greenhouse gas emissions, followed by transportation at 30%. So it's a majority. That's definitely, we need to get to net zero in order to meet our climate goals. And so we do have different financial assistance programs for each of those categories of buildings. So we have types of financial assistance for buildings that are 25,000 square feet and larger. We've got other programs focused on commercial buildings, commercial multifamily, 5,000 square feet and up. And then we have home energy rebates, which are really aimed at single family homes, duplexes, and smaller apartment buildings up to 4 units. We are looking at townhomes as well, they have such a wide variety of formats in townhomes that we just kind of look at them case by case. But yeah, we're actually funding this people. Listen, your furnace is going to die one day. Everybody's furnace dies one day. Generally, when you're a homeowner, it happens once. It's a really big deal. It's a big expense. We would like people to know that they can use an air source heat pump that will provide not only heating, but also cooling to their home, which in Denver is actually a really important feature.
Yeah.
Most of our homes that were built before the 90s don't have air conditioning because Denver didn't need it. Yes, it would get hot during the day, but it would always cool down really nicely at night. And we had a good breeze. That just is not the case anymore. We have really hot summer days and really hot summer nights. And cooling is becoming much more essential just for people to stay healthy in their home. And so we want people to know that an air source heat pump can provide both heating and cooling. And we are providing, not only do we provide a rebate for that equipment itself, we also add on rebates for the electrical panel upgrade that most homes need in order to in order to electrify.
Wow. Huh. That's awesome. Yeah. I grew up in Oregon, and my dad used to say that there was maybe 1 week a year in the summer where it'd be nice to have air conditioning, and now they just installed it because it's gotten so much. It's the same kind of story. It got so much worse over the summer that it's now kind of a requirement. Yeah.
It really is. And so we're also getting to the commercial buildings, we're doing the same thing for them. It's obviously just a much larger amount of money. And in that case, we are really focused on trying to provide as many of our resources as possible to buildings that serve under-resourced people. So we're talking about, affordable housing complexes, buildings that are not necessarily in affordable housing, but the people who they serve are low-income people. Same thing with, community institutions that serve people who are under-resourced. So we're really trying to focus on those buildings that are undoubtedly undercapitalized and have less access to the capital that they would need in order to electrify.
How do you kind of identify those buildings or those companies that are doing that serving those populations? Like how do you go, like, this is the kind of area that we want to prioritize? Is it just kind of neighborhoods, or are there certain things that you're looking for?
Well, so on a surface level, certainly as a city, we know where our under-resourced people and communities are, but that's another place where our team has actually been out in communities holding meetings with the public to say, what are the important institutions in your community where you want us to focus our efforts? Where are where do people who have low incomes in your community live? Because you're right, we wouldn't necessarily know about an apartment building that happens to charge lower rents than other buildings and isn't also, designated as an affordable housing complex.
Yeah.
So we're actually out there talking to people, and then they're helping us map it out so we can find those people, those communities.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's community driven as much as like you guys saying this neighborhood, by the statistics is is in need of investment. Interesting.
Right. And cool. I think that with Denver is like many cities, Denver's communities are seeing a lot of change in population, especially in a city like ours, which has a real deficit of housing in general and affordable housing especially. Yeah. If we were to only use geographic criteria, we would not capture all the people who actually need assistance. Yeah. And we would probably end up providing assistance to buildings that are well capitalized and just happen to be moving into neighborhoods that are undercapitalized. And that is something we need to be really wary of. Interesting.
That's fascinating. Okay. So just to switch to another cool area that you guys are working in, so the mobility kind of space, like what are some of the programs that your staff are working on there? Like what are the kinds of things you guys are trying to do?
Sure. Well, transportation is really expensive, right? Yeah. And so imagine $40 million a year spread across 6 different categories. Doesn't leave a whole lot of money for transportation. Yeah. Especially given that it can cost $1 million to just build 1 mile of bike lanes, right? So, and there is another agency called the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. They're the ones who really manage Denver's roadways. They put in the bike lanes. They do all the pedestrian infrastructure. So that is a niche that's already covered by others. We, however, have the niche in electrified mobility. And so we are really focused on ensuring that people in Denver have access to public charging stations for electric vehicles. So for that, for example, this is actually not through our fund, but through CARES Act dollars that we got at the end of 2020. We worked with a local car share company to install 6 electric vehicle charging stations on the public way, and then funded 7 electric vehicles that are now car share vehicles stationed at those charging points. And we subsidized memberships for 450 people.
Wow.
And then all of those stations are located in under-resourced communities that also they don't have a lot of off-street private parking. So that's this is kind of holistic look we're trying to take when it comes to electrified vehicle travel, at least. And then we have our most popular program, which has been the e-bike rebates.
Yeah.
So much like home energy rebates, there's an interesting origin story on this. So during the pandemic, our state energy office came out with a pilot program to provide electric bikes for essential workers. And we piggybacked on that idea. And we also funded what we call e-bike libraries for essential workers. They're not like a bike share where you have to use your phone or an app to reserve a bike. Instead, a person can actually have a bike assigned to them for weeks at a time, and then they just use it like it's their bike. And if they need help, then the organization who runs the e-bike library can help them with it. So then we built on top of that and said, well, let's just see if we could, what would happen? What would happen to the market for e-bikes if we gave people more money to help them buy an e-bike?
Yeah.
And so it was April of 2022, so Earth Day, it was a Friday. We launched our e-bike rebate program. And, being a government agency, we didn't know if people were going to find out about it. We did the best we could to advertise it. We got a little earned media. That was a Friday. By Tuesday morning, it was sold out. And by sold out, we had planned for 3,000 e-bike rebates for the year.
No way.
We had 3,000 applications by then. And so this contract, we obviously, like many cities, right, we have to do everything through RFPs and contracts to have a third-party administrator run that program for us. We ended up spending all of the money that we had planned to spend over 3 years. We spent it all in 2022.
Oh my gosh.
And over 4,700 people bought e-bikes through our program. And it was equally split between the standard rebate, which is for any resident of Denver who applied. And at the time they could get $400. And it's really a prebate. So they get a voucher, which they take to one of the local bike shops. And that voucher reduces the price they actually have to pay at the point of purchase, rather than paying it all up front and getting paid back later. So that's the standard rebate. The income qualified rebate was $1,200. And we had, an equal split of the number of people who are income qualified versus the standard rebate who actually purchased e-bikes last year.
Wow.
Yeah. And every month that we offered it, so we did April, and then we offered it again July, August, September, October, November. And in each case, it was sold out in 20 minutes or less.
Wow. Okay.
It's really exciting. And so we just launched it again for this year.
Yeah.
The standard rebate amount has gone down to $300. The income qualified rebate's the same at $1,200. One of the interesting data points that we got from last year's program is that the average cost of an e-bike purchased through our program in 2022 went down by $500 between April and December. And the real reason for that is there was more competition in the marketplace because there was such a high demand.
Oh, interesting.
It was really interesting. And
That's
so
really cool.
when we opened on January 31st at 11 o'clock in the morning, it was again sold out in 20 minutes.
Wow.
And 7,000 people started the application process online for 860 rebates.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh
and so this time we're going to do it every other month. And that really helps the bike shops because they know they'll have a steady stream of customers coming in, and they can work with their suppliers to make sure that they have the stock on hand.
Wow. Yeah, when I read about that program, I was like, is it worth moving to Denver just to help with
I know. Well, we would certainly encourage other cities to look at it, and let's all advocate. You know, there was a moment in time when our federal government was considering at least a tax rebate for people to purchase e-bikes. And so every little bit helps. Tax rebates can be a little tricky. They only help if you have a tax liability or tax credit. I shouldn't say tax rebate, tax credit. And so that certainly leaves out a lot of people, but it's at least a stepping stone. And then, cities, especially if cities don't have the dollars available to them like Denver does, I would certainly encourage them to at least look at creating a program for income qualified people, so that they're directing their dollars to the people who need it the most.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Such a cool program, and we'll be sure to link to it. I know you have a webpage about it.
We do. I don't know if we have our stats there. We actually surveyed all the people who got rebates from us and used them to buy a bike. We surveyed them this past fall, and we learned that they are on average biking 26 miles a week, and they're replacing 3 to 4 car trips every week.
Wow.
Because I suppose we should get back to, why are we doing e-bikes?
Yeah.
Like, what does it have to do with climate change? As I mentioned earlier, transportation is the second largest source of our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's actually the number one source of air pollution in Denver, which is quite a serious problem. And we all know that the majority of trips nationwide are less than 6 miles, and especially here in Denver, right? And most trips are also people traveling alone in their car. So that's a lot of trips that can be replaced by an electric bike. And I think that, the results of our survey have shown that as soon as a person has that mobility device available to them, they use it. Yeah. And I have one. I did not get it through the program. I got it through the father-in-law discount. I got one handed down to me, which was nice. And it is really, really joyful to ride. And I think people just get so excited about it as soon as they're on it. We're going to see an uptick, I think, in the miles that people are driving every week, or biking every week, I should say.
That's very cool. So I'm curious, there's obviously the supplying folks with e-bikes, but also the infrastructure. And you mentioned this already, that there's another department that handles this, but that's also a key component to like getting folks to switch from cars to other options. So like, how are you guys working with that, other departments in the city to encourage mobility through the built environment and like the options that folks have just kind of around town? Because it's one thing to have an e-bike. It's another to feel safe, like on the road, on a bike kind of around town.
You're right. So certainly Denver is, like many cities, Denver is working on building out our formal bike lane infrastructure. We should have 125 miles of bike lane before the end of this year, I think is the goal. And so that's helpful. Denver's also been doing a lot of experimenting with different types of protected bike lanes. And I can describe one to you that's on my route, which I think is fantastic for where there's the street space for it. All they did was swap the location of the side of the street parking and the bike lane. So it goes, parkway or tree lawn, depending on who's listening, then the bike lane, and then parking, and then the roadway. And so the parked cars essentially create a protected bike lane for the cyclists. And on my route in particular, it's a very busy street that's on. And I feel very safe in that type of environment. And so it's not to say that's the only solution. Denver also has, bike lanes with raised curbs. We have bike lanes with bollards. So I think our transportation department is really studying to see which types of these treatments will drive more cyclists to particular roadways, to see which are most effective. We also have neighborhood bikeways, which are really just streets that's where we know people cycle. And like I take at least one of them for about a third of my ride. It's just a nice, quiet side street. I mean, cyclists know where they feel safe. And so I think it makes sense for city infrastructure planners to follow them, right? See where are they going, and to ensure that those safe routes that they've already found stay safe.
Yeah. No, it's amazing once you get out on a bike or I mean, honestly, just walking around or running around your city, like you figure out where those quiet streets are pretty quick.
Right.
That's really cool. So I guess just to kind of put a button on it. So are you guys helping like them prioritize, or is the Department of Infrastructure kind of operating in their own way to help achieve this kind of overall goal of like encouraging more
Sure. Well, not unlike the task force that I mentioned, which is an external stakeholder process, we also have those internal to the city. And so we absolutely are working at a staff level and executive level with the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, just to ensure that all of our programs and policies are aligned. Denver's going through a really big infrastructure planning process right now called Denver Moves Everyone. And it's been a huge stakeholder engagement process, again, engaging the public as well as fellow city agencies. And so we're there. Now, I wouldn't say that I'm not the person who determines the map,
Yeah.
but certainly I think that department does take our policies and programs into consideration when they're working on their data as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's awesome. Yeah, that's the most some of the most interesting thing about this work, I think, is like how do you collaborate and cooperate and and coordinate work with other departments that have huge impact on climate action and your team's goals, right? But you don't have direct control over how they do their work.
That's true. And I think that, we're now in our third year of being an agency, and I think that we've definitely seen, was it a turning of the tide or tipping point, however you want to put it. I think that in the past, people were in other agencies were concerned about what we might be asking them to do. What my favorite way to describe what our agency does is we're really only asking for two things. We're only asking our colleagues to do completely new things that they've never done before. And we're asking them to do things that they've always done in a completely different way.
Yeah.
Right. And they know that. And so I think at first there was a lot of trepidation of what were we going to ask of them? How high are the demands going to be? How much would we upset their plans? But we're very collaborative in our approach. We're also very innovative. And, our goal is to get to yes.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times what that means is we need to understand what are the pain points that other people have? What are their goals? What are their priorities? And how could our solutions be solutions for them too?
Yeah.
And so just in the last week or two, and I wish I could remember which agency it was. It's probably best I don't say anyway.
Yeah.
But a person from a different agency said to me, describe this conversation that they were having in one of their own meetings. And people there actively said, well, all right, well, what's Castor's position? Castor, sorry, is the acronym for our office. What's Castor's position on this? What are they going to say, or what programs they have? So the fact that other people now are embedding this in their own work without us even being in the room.
Yep.
That's a win.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, that's when you start to get probably real change. Is you're not there pushing them anymore. It's them already thinking about it, right?
That's right.
Awesome. So
we can't succeed without those big agencies.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I mentioned, my agency doesn't own the building code or the zoning code. We don't design the streets and pedestrian infrastructure. We don't run the parks and make decisions about landscapes and trees. We need those other implementing agencies to feel that and believe that the solutions that we're suggesting are solutions that will work for them and that will achieve their goals too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So one other area that you mentioned is that you guys work in, and it's an area that I think it gets talked is the jobs program. So kind of the green economy. Yeah. And I know that often gets brought out as in kind of the national talking points around climate action is this could be a benefit. But I'm curious kind of the local impact of what does that actually look like, and how can local governments have a hand in pushing these kind of opportunities? Because it seems
a lot of us were working for local government during the ARPA years, and there was a really big focus on training. Right, we got to get people into jobs, we got to get them trained. What happened was you get people trained in weatherization or solar or electrification, and they go out of those programs and there were no jobs.
Yeah,
and so our position is that the policies that we are working on, like electrification requirements for, existing commercial buildings, and we now have our first electrification requirements for new construction as well, that those policies build the demand for jobs.
Yeah.
And so then we come in paired along with that. Yes, we're creating these policies. We're also going to create or help fund the jobs programs that will get people trained to meet the needs that those policies, or meet the demand those policies are creating.
Yeah.
So the first work we did with that, and since I'm assuming that the audience, of course, is fellow government folk,
yep,
I would encourage you to consider this. The way we use our RFPs is, I think, pretty unique. Most RFPs are competitive, right? Only one firm can win. We don't do that with most of our RFPs. So with our first workforce program, request for proposal, we received 6 proposals. So proposals from 6 different organizations that all met our criteria. So we contracted with all of them. Separate contracts, one RFP. It was such a huge time saver for all of us just to, get the work, get the money out there, get people, into these job training programs. And each one of the programs, fills the spectrum. So we have a contract with Denver Public Schools. So they're doing career exploration and exposure programs for high school students interested in getting into solar or HVAC or, electrical work, and all the way up through actual on the job pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs with the International Facility Management Association.
Cool.
And then there's a couple other programs in between, right? So it's the full spectrum of getting people, we're not just creating a pipeline. Wait, there has to be a place at the end of the pipeline. There has to be an actual job. And that's what we're really focused on with our workforce programs.
Huh. That's fascinating. That's really cool. So, I mean, is some of that working with businesses to be like, this is, this is something that you guys should be in the business of doing, or or is it just, you have to kind of build the demand or create the demand and then build the supply and hope they kind of meet down the line at some point?
I think that we consult with the business community to ensure that we're understanding what their needs are. And a good example of that is in electric vehicles, specifically for fleets. So we are hearing from especially other government agencies that have fleets, but some private fleets as well, that want to add electric vehicles to their fleet, but they are concerned that there aren't enough technicians who are skilled in maintaining those cars. Now, granted, we all know that EVs don't take as much maintenance, but I think that when it's a fleet vehicle, their usage is so much higher than your average household electric vehicle. They really do have a need to maintain those cars. And so since we have heard that demand, now we're working with one of the local community colleges and one of our local high schools that have vehicle maintenance programs, and they are starting now to have electric vehicle certifications. And I think at the high school, what we need to do is we actually need to help them fund a new technician who has a different type of electrical certification, because they're really concerned about the safety. So that's how we get. So yes, that's to the extent that we hear from businesses what their demand is, and then we design the programs around that need.
My next question for you, what's kind of next? Like, what are you working on that our listeners ought to look out for? What are things that, you'll be working on in the next 6 months or a year?
I'll tell you one. And I think this one's important because it's in that category of environmental justice and also the climate adaptation and resiliency category, which for us needs to be focused on the neighborhoods that are the most vulnerable to climate change and have the least resiliency. So we have just started a Promotoris program. And a Promotoris program essentially utilizes residents of neighborhoods who may not be professionals in this field at all, but they are trusted messengers in their community. And so they are actually going to be educating their fellow residents on issues of climate change that are relevant to their community. And we are going to study their work over a period of about 2.5 years. They're going to do some pre-campaign surveys to figure out, just what is the baseline? What is the baseline knowledge of people in the community about climate change issues and what they see as solutions? Then the Promotoros will develop their own campaigns. Again, unique to their community. What are folks interested in working on, whether it's, avoiding food waste or learning about, future water scarcity or water conservation, extreme heat. They're going to work on those campaigns, and then they're going to survey their people again to see what their impact has been. And what we're going to glean from that, we're going to glean so much, right? We'll especially get information on what kind of communications methods work best, like what actually reaches folks who are hard to reach. But I think more importantly than any of that, our agency, and then of course the city also as a beneficiary, we will have established relationships in communities that have really low trust in government and may even have a lot of fear of interacting with government. But we are an agency that has services to offer, and we want people to know who we are, and we want them to know that we are here to provide services and support for their communities. And so we're really excited to see where that program leads.
Yeah, that's really cool. So the trusted messengers, I already forgot the name you used, but how are you guys finding them or?
Sure. Well, that's another program where we had to put out an RFP. We contracted with 5 different community-based organizations. Cool. And so the community-based organizations are getting paid. They are then paying the Promotoras, which are the people who are actually be doing the community-based engagement with residents.
Cool. Promotores. That's a new word. That's a new vocab word for everybody. I like that.
There are probably people who are in the public health space who might be very familiar with that term.
Yeah.
When the Affordable Care Act first launched, a number of cities used Promotores programs to get information out to hard to reach neighborhoods and hard to reach populations to help people learn about the program and to get enrolled.
Awesome.
So we're just adapting it to climate.
Yeah, to climate. That's really cool. Awesome. So listeners will have to keep an eye out for that. We'll have to have you be back and see how the engagement goes.
I would be happy to.
So we have a traditional last question on the podcast.
Okay.
It's usually the hardest one for guests. So if you could be the GovLove DJ and got to pick the exit music for this episode, what song would you pick?
All right. I'm gonna go ahead and say this, and we're recording this in February. February is Black History Month. And so I would encourage everybody to go find a recording of the song Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Awesome.
Do you know it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yep. It is the Black American National Anthem. It is a beautiful song. Everybody should know it.
That's great. That's a great pick and timely for Black History Month. So
yes.
Well done. Great. So that ends our episode for today. Grace, thank you so much for coming on and talk with me and sharing your expertise and all the cool work going on in Denver.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by Engaging Local Government Leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can go to elgl.org to join today. You can also reach GovLove online at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at the handle @GovLovePodcast. And subscribe to GovLove on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. If you're already subscribed, share this podcast with a friend or colleague and help spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
Facing a rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on to victory.